Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's show. On today's show, I do have a very special guest for the show. It is Miss Patricia Young. She is a licensed clinical social worker and coach for highly sensitive people. She has a private practice based out of San Diego, California. And today she's going to come on the show and talk about what a highly sensitive person is, which I think is a very important topic because there are quite a few of my listeners out there who have expressed that they feel that they're highly sensitive or more empathic, and that's why they are more kind, caring, and compassionate and drawn in to narcissistic people. So she's going to talk a little bit about her experience in working with folks on the opposite end of the kind of the spectrum, as if you will, and some of the struggles and the strengths and how she works with people that have highly sensitive perceptions and things of that nature. And so I'm really hoping to, I hope that you will like this episode. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the show, Patricia. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Jones. I'm really glad to be here.
All right. And so I'm excited for you to be on because you're going to talk about a topic that I don't usually talk about and that I'm not as well versed in as yourself. But for my audience of listeners who are not familiar with you, can you talk a little bit about you, your passion, and what you do?
Sure. I'm a therapist turned coach, and I have a podcast called Unapologetically Sensitive, and I specialize in working with highly sensitive people, which is a research trait that was discovered by or coined by Dr. Elaine Aron back in the 90s. And we can talk about this more as we go on, but basically, if you've ever been told you're too sensitive, too needy, you worry too much, you think too much, you can't take a joke, you need to get thicker skin, you have a really strong sense of justice and wanting things to be fair and right, and you probably are a giver, you're loyal, you're compassionate, you're creative. And what happens is when we don't know that this is an innate trait and that there's nothing wrong with us, we can take our perceived shortcomings and turn them into superpowers. So that's really what my work is all about.
Wow. And a lot of the traits you named off, it sounds a lot like my astrological sign, which is a Libra.
Okay.
Right. So talk a little bit about why you're passionate about that and how you kind of got involved in niching yourself around highly sensitive people.
Well, highly sensitive people make up about 20% of the population. That's what Dr. Aron estimates. So we're a minority. So many of us feel like we're the misfits. You know, as a kid, I felt like I was an old soul. I related much more to adults and really felt like I had a lot of shortcomings. And our culture doesn't value sensitivity for the most part. So we get a lot of messages about don't cry, toughen up, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, get over it. We tend to be deep thinkers and deep feelers. And so I always felt like something was wrong with me. And the advantage for me of finding out about the trait of high sensitivity is it validated who I am. And when you don't know that you're wired a certain way, now I know I'm 20% of the population and I'm not going to be like the other 80%. I don't want to be like the other 80%. And I think we have a lot of pressure to try and fit in and be like non-HSPs. highly sensitive people, HSP. And often we struggle a lot with overwhelm from overstimulation. And so we're not always able to show up in the same way that non-HSPs are. And if we don't know what our traits are and what our strengths and limitations are, we're not able to advocate for ourselves and also provide information for other people about why these are the things that work for us and these are the things that don't. It's just perceived as a deficit. We see it as a deficit. Other people see it as a deficit. And we kind of fall into that trap. And once we know what the trait is, we can advocate for ourselves and provide education for other people.
Okay. And I'm glad you said that because you talked a little bit about what other people's perceptions are of highly sensitive people. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the traits of highly sensitive people in terms of, what do they experience? What are their sensitivities, their strengths, and their limitations?
Sure. What I'd like to do, if you're okay, is Dr. Elaine Aaron, she's the primary research. So I always refer back to her. This is not my
Sure.
information. And then I obviously have my own life information. She defines the 4 core characteristics of being a highly sensitive person as it states the word does or does, DOES. And so these are kind of the 4 characteristics. D is for depth of processing. We're deep thinkers. So we have a more active insula, the part of our brain that helps enhance perception and increase self-awareness. So we always have that observer that we kind of see what we're saying, what other people are saying. Some people can go into a situation and they just have, I don't mean this judgmentally, but don't have a lot of awareness about what's going on for them and other people. Highly sensitive people, we're very tuned in. So we're wired to pause and reflect before engaging. And so we're always taking in a lot of information and we're thinking very deeply about it. So sometimes it means we need more time for transition and sometimes we need more time to make decisions. The next one is O for overstimulation or overarousal. And because we notice more subtle details in our environment, we're more emotionally impacted by social situations. So we get overstimulated and exhausted by high levels of input. So often we don't like watching violence. The news can be upsetting. Watching children or animals be hurt can be very difficult because we're always taking in so much information. It's kind of like this is my term, but it's like our nervous systems are kind of on fire if we get too much, and it can really burn us out, and we need more time to have quiet time and to retreat.
Hmm.
The E is for emotional responsiveness or empathy. So brain scans have shown that HSPs have more active mirror neurons, which are responsible for feelings of empathy for others, and more activity in areas that are involved with emotional responses. So HSPs are going to feel things more deeply, whether they're positive or negative. And there's something that's called differential susceptibility. So if you put an HSP in a positive environment, we're going to do much better than non-HSPs. The converse is true, that if you put us in a poor environment, a work situation, a marriage, a relationship, school where we're not seen and heard, we're going to fare much worse than the non-HSP. And then the last one is awareness to subtle stimuli. So we notice subtle details that other people miss, such as nonverbal cues, small changes in their environment, in our environment. We're also more impacted by strong sensory input, bright lights, loud noises, strong smells. We often have issues around clothing, labels and tags, seams and socks, tight clothes around the waist, belts. We're very sensitive to those things. And so that's why you're probably not going to find HSPs thriving in a loud bar or a concert where there's lots of people, noise and stimulation. It's just too much.
Wow, so that's a lot of stuff, and I think that that definitely encapsulates what I've learned about it back in, excuse me, back in grad school. So thank you so much for sharing that. And in terms of highly sensitive people, what do they struggle with when you're coaching them? What do you notice are the struggles that people are kind of coming to you with?
Well, definitely getting messages about it's not okay to be who they are. And because of what we talked about, that differential susceptibility. And if you're a parent, it's not my intention to make anybody worry even more. We tend to be thinkers, we're great problem solvers and troubleshooters, but we also tend to take in information and use it to beat ourselves up. But sometimes all it takes is having a parent who's a non-highly sensitive person. So if a child is having deep feelings about something and the parent says, don't worry about it, let it go, that's enough to kind of start a separation from sense of self. So then we get more of those messages, and then we feel like we make a big deal out of things. We've been told we're too dramatic. So we end up not trusting our perceptions, and it's not uncommon to have a sense of overwhelm, feeling like we're making a big deal out of things. And so a lot of the work that I do is providing education so that everything you're thinking and feeling is really okay. And changing the narrative of, I worry about things too much, or I've been told that I perseverate, I can't let things go. There's a strength to that, and figuring out how do we figure out what works for us, how do we use tools to work with our thinking, but also to stop trying to be something that we're not. So an example for me is I have high expectations, and I was told for many years to stop having such high expectations. When I realized I was a highly sensitive person, I'm always going to have high expectations. The way that I show up in the world is at a pretty high level, and I function at a high level, not in all areas. I have lots of areas where I struggle. But the result is I get disappointed a lot. I get frustrated a lot. So the way that I deal with that is when I find myself feeling frustrated and disappointed, I'm like, it just happened again. I had an expectation that I didn't even realize. It didn't get met. I got frustrated and disappointed. Okay, now what do I need to do? So it's taking these traits and accepting them instead of trying to not have them and be something that we're not. We figure out how to work with them and then use tools so that we can move forward. Does that answer your question?
It does. And can you talk a little bit about the strength-based approach that you use, and how you show people how to work with, things that they've been taught over time or been conditioned to believe, or nuances rather than strengths?
Sure. Well, so much of the work that I do is looking at what is the negative messaging that we've gotten, providing education, and then reframing it. Because I honestly believe that, what we think is wrong with us is what's really right with us, and our perceived shortcomings are really our greatest strengths. So I was told that I think too much, I worry too much, I'm too sensitive. It makes me an incredibly empathic therapist. It makes me an empathic coach and friend. I'm very loyal. I have a very strong sense of what people are going through because of all the things that I've struggled with. So it gives me that ability to connect with other people. And if somebody tells me that I'm too sensitive or I'm thinking too much, I really get curious and try and figure out what does that mean to them, because it's really not about me. It's about them.
Mm.
And so the shift with clients is when they come into therapy and feel that these are all their deficits, and we start looking at it, then they get to see that these are really strengths. And an example is I was just working with a client who had a relationship that didn't work out. And this client's perspective was, I was too much, I was too needy. This client made it all about themselves. And it's not uncommon. I have that same narrative about I'm too much and I'm too needy. I had a single parent that really was very overwhelmed and couldn't deal with my natural emotions. So it's wounding that I have today. It doesn't run me. It still comes up for me. But what we looked at in this relationship was this person's partner spent 2 months kind of distancing, and my client kept asking, is something going on? And at the 2-month mark, the client's partner came back and said, this isn't working for me, and ended the relationship. And so I really worked with this client. If you want to be in a relationship with somebody who's healthy and participates, you need to have mutual communication. And for the person to pull back for 2 months and not communicate, is that what you want in your next relationship? Because this client was really stuck in that if I only would have known, if I only would have changed, if I wouldn't have asked for so much. We have a right to show up exactly as we are. Feelings, needs, everything. There's nothing wrong with it. We need to have people that can manage that and then can communicate with us. And so that's kind of a very specific example of how this shows up with the clients that I see.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'm wondering too, how much does culture play a part in that, in the high sensitivity?
I
Yes.
think it's a huge thing. And I'm not great on Dr. Aaron's research, but I believe that she talks about in Thailand, because they have a very collaborative approach, sensitivity is seen as a strength.
Sure.
I've had some guests on my podcast from India, which is, supposed to be a very collective society. And I have clients that really struggle. I love dance. And so I watch a lot of the dance shows, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen, like on America's Got Talent or a World of Dance, where this group of dancers doesn't win and they cry, and the judges tell them, you're being so strong, you're acting like a boy, or, don't cry, get over it. And on one of the shows, I love Jennifer, um,
Lopez.
thank you.
Yeah.
Said, babies, you guys cry. You cry as much as you need. And then when you're ready, you move on, and, you're just really going to kick it the next time. That we get these subtle messages about it's not okay to have feelings. And these are people that are competing for really big things. And it's, again, that thing of expectations and disappointments that we as a culture are so afraid of having strong feelings that the analogy I use is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. We don't want to feel disappointed. We don't want to feel angry. We don't want to feel hurt. We spend all this time holding that beach ball underwater, as opposed to just allowing ourselves to have the strong responses. They come, they go, we move on. But our culture is not really supportive of that. I think it's changing. And I feel so passionate about letting people know, like, feelings are just feelings.
Absolutely. And I was, as you were talking, one of the things that kind of came up for me in terms of our culture, specifically US-based culture, a lot of the conditioning that just the general public receives is that it's not okay to be ill. It's not okay to be overweight. It's not okay to not look good. It's not okay to, sometimes it's not okay to be Black. It's not okay. Like, there's a lot of messages, and that's how a lot of the marketing that we see ads in magazines, or just even pictures in magazines. I mean, even from our magazine that I'm listed on the directory, Psychology Today, has almost never has a woman of color, and all of the people up there, even within our field, are only thin, very pale white women. So there's a lot of just subliminal messages all around on media, print, and what have you, that says it's not okay to be who you are. And I'm just wondering, for you, how much do you think that also plays a part in being highly sensitive, or having attacks against you, I guess, since you're highly sensitive?
I think those messages are very strong. They're very powerful. They're incredibly subtle, so we often don't even know that we're getting them. And our culture is really about doing, striving, and succeeding. And that the messages that we get as our self-esteem comes from goal-oriented achievements. And when you're a highly sensitive person, for me, my life is really about deep feelings, deep thoughts, connection, empathy, and my capacity is much less than somebody who's a non-HSP. I need more downtime. I don't see as many clients as a non-HSP would. I really need, I don't like this analogy, and this really sucks if you're a guy. So guys, please forgive me. But they've used the analogy of the orchid, and I talk about the proper care and feeding of the HSP, that, orchids require very specific requirements in order to thrive. And when they have those, they thrive. And it's the same thing with highly sensitive people. We need to get enough rest. We need to have enough downtime. We need to find ways to lovingly move our bodies. Many of us have autoimmune disorders or sensitivities to food. We work better in certain environments. And when we can create lifestyles that meet those needs, we do much better. And it's very counterintuitive to what society tells us is successful.
Okay. And it sounds like there's a lot of just internalization that kind of happens when you're highly sensitive. And so can you go back for a second and tell us, if someone is thinking, oh, wow, a lot of the traits or characteristics that Patricia is describing sounds like me, but they're not sure, they want to be sure that, hey, perhaps this is me, how can they find out if they are in fact a highly sensitive person?
Dr. Aaron's website at hsperson.com has a self-test, and you can go and take it. If you suspect that you're highly sensitive and you take the self-test and you don't score in the range that she suggests, what Dr. Aaron suggests is to take the child version of the test and think back to when you were a child and things that you were told about yourself. And I can tell you that I could not tell you what a feeling was. In my family, we didn't do feelings. And when I was 30, I was in a treatment center for an eating disorder, and we had to do a daily check-in with feelings. I couldn't even tell you what a feeling was. What was acceptable in my family was to use words as kind of a wall. And one of the contracts that I had was I could talk in one sentence because I did not know how to let people see me, and I had to really learn to get in touch with my feelings. So there's a good chance that had I taken the highly sensitive test at age 30, I wouldn't have even come close to being a highly sensitive person. I don't know, but so much of my own healing has been about kind of deconstructing all those defenses and really getting in touch with how deeply I do feel and how much I connect. We also tend to have a pretty strong connection to animals, to nature, to music. Those things really restore us, and they just fill us up and move us.
And it's very interesting that she requests that people take the child version. That's interesting to me.
Why is that?
The one thing I was thinking of is maybe is it because there was wounded childhood type stuff that's kind of coming up that, maybe it didn't apply then, and maybe you've kind of changed as you became an adult, like perhaps, you might have started out as a sensitive child, but over time you got these messages, and so you've adapted, or you've been conditioned to kind of be this way, is what I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's something that we're born with, and so it's never going to go away, but we often learn to bury it. And I don't know an awful lot about the research around men, but I think for men it's even harder because sensitivity is not valued when you're a woman, and to be a man, especially if you tend to be more tearful and emotional, that is just not culturally acceptable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing that Dr. Aaron's research indicates is that, and I don't know how she would define this, I have my own definition, but she says that HSPs that had, difficult childhoods have higher rates of anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really find when people come to me is sometimes they hate the traits of high sensitivity, but it's really the wounding from childhood around those traits. And once we do healing around the wounding, then we can see the magnificent qualities that we have being HSPs. But because people get so many negative messages around their traits, they hate the trait, they hate themselves, but we need to tease those things out.
And that's kind of what I was thinking too, as you were talking, that I would imagine there's a fair amount of anxiety and depression about, just self-doubt and just internalization in general typically tends to cause symptoms that are consistent with that. Um, would you say that highly sensitive people are also called empaths? I hear that word kind of being thrown around a lot too now, is I'm an empath.
I'm not really familiar with empaths, and it's interesting that I just had somebody on my podcast and had asked ahead of time, like, are you able to clearly delineate? And by the end of the interview, I don't, this is where I can be very linear, and I don't feel like this person was able to clearly delineate. What I've been told is some HSPs are empaths, some empaths are HSPs. It's kind of when you take on other people's feelings is my understanding of empaths, but I really don't know that much to speak intelligently about it.
Very, very, very good. Yeah. And, I thought that was just something that I would ask about. But I'm also curious too, my podcast stems around narcissistic abuse. That's the main focus point. And I'm curious from your perspective, Is this something that's common among highly sensitive people, or is this a common complaint or something that you kind of tease out? And just based upon some of our discussion already, it does feel like there's something in there. But do you feel like this is something that they commonly experience, or is it the fact, how can I put this in a way, that they feel so intently that they just experience more, if that makes sense.
Right. I'm a little reluctant. I will answer, and I'm a little reluctant because I feel like you're an expert in narcissism, and I only know from what I see coming through my practice. A number of my HS clients have a parent who's a narcissist, and then it's not uncommon for them to partner up with someone who's also a narcissist, who has told them repeatedly that they're self-centered, or that, you know, they make it all about them, or they don't care about other people. Because HSPs are incredibly conscientious and we're loyal and we care about people, we have an ability to go into a room and see what people need. We're very responsive. I always joke about it's a very old cartoon, but Chip and Dale, the chipmunks, where it's like, no, after you, no, please, after you. That in some ways, to me, personifies an HSP, just really wanting to have everybody feel good and get along. And so in my estimation, that's kind of perfect prey for a narcissist, because the narcissist is there to shine and look like the knight in shining armor. And the HSP loves that sense of connection and can really feed what the narcissist wants. So I feel like I don't want to go too much further because I'm going into your territory, but from my side on HSPs,
Yeah.
it is very, very common for narcissists and HSPs to get into relationships, and then it ends up being pretty detrimental for the highly sensitive person.
Mm. And you've talked a bit about the loyalty piece. Can you talk a little bit more about highly sensitive people and their loyalty? Because I get the sense, and working with the folks that I work with, that they're drawn to that. A narcissist would definitely be drawn to the loyalty piece. But can you talk about it from the perspective of a highly sensitive person?
Sure, we're very conscientious. We're very mindful about what we do. We want to do our best. We give our all. We're very loyal. We're very compassionate. And it's interesting. I'm going through something in a longstanding relationship with a girlfriend. So I'm using this as an example because this isn't a romantic relationship. I don't
Yeah,
depend on this person. This person doesn't
sure.
live in town. We have this long-standing relationship, and it's become clear to me in the last, I don't know, 6 months that I'm growing, this person's changing, and we need to make some shifts. And I have this sense of loyalty due to the longevity of the relationship.
Sure.
How can I throw it away? And there are things that happen in the relationship that drain me. I kind of dread connecting because I'm not sure what I'm going to get. This person isn't wrong. They're not bad. They're not toxic. They're just showing up as they are. So I want to really delineate. We're not talking about a toxic relationship with a narcissist. We're talking about a longstanding friendship with, another person. And I struggle with, is it okay to let go of the relationship? I feel a sense of commitment because of the longevity, and it's not that bad. And there are times when we do connect. So if that shows up in a friendship, that's
Yes.
very simple, very easy to walk away with, very untangled, how is that going to be for someone who's in a romantic relationship with somebody that has even stronger dynamics?
Absolutely. And that's kind of what I was thinking, is that even when things don't work for them, folks that are highly sensitive, they have a difficult time kind of walking away and just letting go, because of the loyalty piece. But I'm also wondering, if that feels like, um, if they internalize that to mean I'm harming someone in a way.
Yeah, and I think because we have such a high ability to empathize, that we can see what the other person is probably going through and how they're going to be impacted, and that persistence to just want to stick in there and work things through and to see things through. We make incredibly great workers and leaders because we listen and we care. We're the social makers, we're the people that want justice, we're the teachers, the healers, the educators, very, very powerful when we are able to step into our strengths.
Mm.
And it can be really hard to go like, this isn't working and it's really okay to put me first.
Mm. And I'm wondering how much projection is going on with the loyalty piece too, in terms of knowing when to let go and saying that if I were to let go, I can cause all this pain on this other person, and perhaps that's happened to them, or perhaps there is a worry that that could happen to them in the future as well.
Sure. And I think that it's a risk and a benefit when you're very empathic, because you really do have the ability to know what your feelings are, to imagine what other people's feelings are going to be. It's high emotional intelligence. And so part of what we need to learn as skills are boundaries and self-care, and surrounding ourselves with people that can support us in what we're doing, because I think we have that pull to go back to what's familiar, even when it doesn't work for us. And so there are lots of things that we need to have in place in order to support us in living the best lives that we can.
And what are some of the things that we should have in place to support us if we are highly sensitive people?
Definitely, you've got to have other people that are highly sensitive around you. I mean, that's just an imperative. If you have wounding, and as a therapist and coach, I've had years and years and years of therapy, and stuff still comes up. I still have things that I struggle with. Part of what I really want to educate people about is it's not a one and done. And I have a bunch of soapboxes, so this is one of mine that I really want to model to people, that just because I'm in a position where I coach people doesn't mean I don't have struggles and that my wounding doesn't come up. Early on in recovery, it would knock me out and it would run me. Today, it's very different, but that wounding, for me, I think it's always going to be there, but it's more like an itch as opposed to feeling like it's going to put me in bed for a week, but it still shows up. So surrounding ourselves with other HSPs, if we've got wounding that we need to do healing, we need to do that, creating lifestyles that really work for us, learning about authenticity and what really works for us. I think that we often don't know what we're thinking and feeling because we've been told to shut it down. So as we start to learn about our traits and we step into them, we get a clearer sense of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. That helps us define what our boundaries are and what's acceptable and not acceptable. But it takes having a good support system to be able to put this into place and to move forward. Life is about things that throw us curveballs, and it just happens. It's not uncommon to be thrown by things, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just learning how to roll with it when it happens, as opposed to like, oh, it's happening again. It's like, okay, here it is again. It doesn't feel good. What do I need to do to move through this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are highly sensitive people, in your experience, are they typically attracted to each other?
I think so. It's interesting. If I look back over the relationships that I had growing up, I always found people that were very compassionate. Because of my wounding, I didn't get enough mothering. So, as a kid, it's like, I want to be the baby. And that kind of lasted into my adulthood. Like, I would choose women that were very nurturing and could really create a holding space for me, because there just wasn't enough of that for me in my childhood. But I think that we are drawn to other people that are similar, that have feelings and can connect with us. And we have a great ability to connect with people, even if we're introverts, because we listen and we're so perceptive.
Mm. How do we, and how do highly sensitive people, once they've let go of a relationship that no longer serves them, what kind of work do they have to do around that?
I think it's ongoing because, even from my own experience, I'm in a second marriage now. We've been married almost 22 years. And after my first marriage ended, we separated. We kept getting back together. It was great until it got lousy. And then we hadn't resolved the problems, and we'd separate, and then I'd miss him when we get back. And that was not, he wasn't a narcissist. I just was young and I didn't know any better. So I think it means having people that can support you, whether it's a coach or a therapist, and having friends and seeing what those patterns are and what's going to pull us back. I just think we always need to be doing our own work about what's coming up for us. What is the pull? Is this a choice that's going to help me or not help me? We're always going to misstep. We're always going to make mistakes. And so really having radical self-compassion, because there's this idea that we set a goal, like I'm going to break up, and that I'm going to do it perfectly. And we may go back and we may misstep and we may drive by the person's house. Having compassion for that is so important because we do the best that we can and we're going to make mistakes. We're human.
Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. And part of the work too, I'm wondering too, when you have wounding around having parents that are perhaps narcissistic, and working with your clients, how do people deal with that are highly sensitive?
That's a really tough one because what I find is that my clients have internalized those messages and beliefs. And in the family, they're usually the scapegoat, they're the truth teller, but they've really bought into that idea that there's something wrong with them. And, often the narcissistic parent colludes with another sibling so that they gang up against the highly sensitive person. There are poor boundaries. It really takes a lot of work because my clients have absorbed so much of this belief that they're the one that's the problem. And so really doing a tremendous amount of educating and exploration to recreate and to kind of change that story about they're the problem to they're the truth teller. And this is a system that really doesn't support their well-being. And how can they navigate in that if they need to be involved with their family? How can they do that and take care of themselves? But I find it probably one of the most challenging parts of working with clients that have narcissistic parents, if they're still in touch with them and they need to be.
Yeah, and what do they normally want to do with those relationships?
I think that they want to cut them off, but they feel like it's not okay when the family is still intact, or if there's some kind of financial dependence that the adult child has on the parent, because it's a little bit of a mixed thing that the parent's supporting them, but with lots of conditions. I, I kind of think that probably if there was no right or wrong, they'd probably want to get out of Dodge. But because of that sense of loyalty or because of practical things, it just doesn't work, or it means having to cut off ties with the entire family. And that's not maybe something that they want to do. It's very complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how do you work with them, especially if they don't want to cut off of, parents or family members that can be very toxic? How do you work with them to kind of manage what their struggles are, or manage helping them using their strengths to kind of navigate that relationship?
It really means trying to figure out what is it that they're wanting in the relationship. Where is it that they feel like they can't cut ties? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? Can they have limited times when they get together? Can they do communication and writing? It's really about what their beliefs are and what they feel that they need, provided, I feel like my job is to provide education and boundaries and teaching them where they can set limits. But it's very sticky.
It sounds like it. Um, do you feel like that's something that is a long-term struggle with HSPs? It sounds like you may feel that way.
With the clients that I have, the clients that I've worked with that are currently in relationship with their parents, or there's a need to stay in touch. If, I think that when the relationship is so toxic and the highly sensitive person has said enough is enough and I'm done, then that's a different kind of healing. The clients that I tend to work with are in relationship and or have some kind of dependence or a need to stay in contact because of grandchildren or
Sure.
combined working relationships. And I think it is a lot harder. I have a client who's got two bosses that are narcissistic, and because of the need to stay in those relationships, it's just really challenging and very hard to set boundaries and to be who you are when you're dealing with a narcissist, because the rules are very different.
Absolutely. And the other piece that I was kind of curious about as you're talking, because highly sensitive people, I'm just going based upon what we're talking about, feel so intently. Do you think their assessment is accurate, or is it that their perceptions are heightened?
I have mixed feelings to that.
Yeah.
That I think that our intuition is can be very, very accurate, and we perceive all kinds of things that other people don't. And there are times when we are perceiving something, but, as Brene Brown says, the story that we make up in our head is not always in alignment with what's going on. And I had this happen with my husband. I'm trying to think of what the situation was. Oh, I have a thing about safety at home, that we have a security screen door that, the inside door is always open. And I like the screen door locked because I read that people are walking into people's houses in my neighborhood. It doesn't make me feel really safe. And as a highly sensitive person, I'm going to imagine more of the terrible things that are going to happen. That's just how I'm wired. I live with 3 males who think that nothing is ever going to happen to anybody. And so that's kind of a constant battle. And we went to leave one day, and my husband went, and my husband is wonderful. I'm not throwing him under the bus. This is nothing that's wrong with him. He goes to go out the door, and it was locked, and he got really frustrated. And, then he kind of unlocks it, and he goes out and he closes the door. And the story that I made up in my head is he's mad at me because I feel unsafe, and I want him to lock the door because his thought is, I'm here to protect you. My thought is, if somebody has a gun, you can't protect me. So I know that my thinking is more elevated than his is. I know that. So I asked him, I said, are you angry about this? And we talked about it, and he just forgets that the door is locked because that's kind of how he's wired. I remember lots of details. There are lots of things that just is not on his radar. And he goes to open the door and he forgets that it's locked, and it's frustrating for him. So had we not had this conversation, I would have had a whole narrative about, he thinks that I am, hypervigilant. He thinks I'm going to get hurt. He thinks and it's like, he just can't remember that I locked the door, and it pisses him off because the door's locked.
Yeah. And I wonder about that. How much of it is miscommunication and misunderstanding in some relationships with HSPs as well, or heightened perceptions or things like that. And I, like you said, it can be, we all have our own version of reality sometimes. And the other piece of that, I was thinking as you were talking, it sounds like you and your husband have a good relationship. And I'm wondering, for those that are not highly sensitive, can they be, is there work that you do to kind of help them understand the needs of highly sensitive people as well?
Yes, and it's a process. I mean, I joke, it's kind of nice. I had my husband on the podcast, and we talked about some of these things. And an example is, we have something in our neighborhood. It's called Walkabout. And not only does he want me to go, he wants me to initiate going. And I go with him because I love him. It's loud. The sidewalks are narrow. It's crowded. It's not my idea of a good time. I really need to conserve my energy on the day of Walkabout. But because I want to play the role of a good wife and I do things that support my husband, I go. But I use the analogy of, you asking me to initiate going to Walkabout is the equivalent of me saying, I want you to initiate going bra shopping with me. Like, he'll go with me. It's not something he loves to do, but for me to expect him to say, honey, I want to go bra shopping with you today. Like, it's just not going to happen. And what I love is, in this podcast interview, when I explain to him, it's like, it's noisy, there's loud, there's lights. I don't like it. Like, he's like, come on, it's not the same as bra shopping. But I think he started to get a little bit of an insight of, we're different. And I think it's really common for all of us to kind of think everybody is wired the same way that we are. But when we start talking, we realize that not everybody's wired the same way. So it means understanding ourselves, understanding other people. I think there's so much power in naming what goes on and talking about it without having judgment or criticism. But it's constant negotiation when you have a partner that's a non-HSP, because it's frustrating for the HSP and it's frustrating for the non-HSP. And for parents that have kids that are highly sensitive, you've got a whole other thing where your kids are having strong reactions to things because they get triggered. And if you don't understand that, it can be really frustrating as a parent as well.
And I think the common theme, or what makes it work, if the two of you are able to kind of communicate and compromise, is acceptance. It sounds like there's some acceptance that you're different, he's different, but you guys are able to kind of meet in the middle somewhere.
Yes. And I think it's really common for the whole narrative, the whole story about the relationship to be about the HSP. And as I've started my podcast and seeing new layers, that I think the story in our marriage was, I don't like to go on vacation and I don't like to do this and I don't like to do that. And as we started to unpack it, he and I took a vacation many, many years ago, and he watched sports and read a book, and I felt really not attended to. Now, it was my responsibility to say, like, hey, let's do something. I just didn't have the awareness to do that. And so I made a decision, like, vacations with my husband aren't fun. So we didn't go on them for a long time. Or we still have this narrative that he likes to do these things and I don't. Well, you know what? I love sailing. I love kayaking. There are lots of things that I like that he doesn't. We've just
Hmm.
taken them off the table and we don't talk about them. And so even when we talked about doing this vacation, he's like, where do you want to go? I said, I want to go to the beach. He says, I think we should go to the mountains. I'm like, wait a second. You just asked me where I want to go, and then you overrode me and told me where we should go. Again, my husband is not a bad person. This is about me really claiming what works for me and standing up for myself. But I've had to say, wait a second, we've had this story about, I don't like to do stuff on vacation. The reality is you don't like to engage in a number of the activities that I'm passionate about. And where my shortcoming is I haven't cultivated those things that I love doing in my life just because he doesn't like it. That's on me. So there are lots of ways that we can make up stories about, well, it's, the highly sensitive person, but it really is a two-way street.
Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. As is in all relationships, right?
Yeah.
There just needs to be respect and compromise. Absolutely. And I appreciate you saying that. How long term, if you're highly sensitive person, long term, what do you do to foster that long term and nurture that, I should say, long term?
It goes back to what I call the proper care and feeding of the HSP, that we tend to have a need for connection, for deep connection, meaning, having meaning in our lives, having depth in our relationships. So having, again, I'm talking from what I see. I can't speak for every highly sensitive person. So if I've said something that doesn't fit for you, that feels like it's a generalization, it's not my intention to put all highly sensitive people into one category, because we're all individual. But having lives that have meaning, having downtime, having time in nature, we're just sensitive and responsive to many things. So I know for me, when my life gets out of balance, I often stop moving my body. I don't always make the best food choices. My sleep gets disrupted because my mind is really busy. So those are areas that are kind of, it's kind of like playing with the whack-a-mole game, that I get, one or two things in balance and then something else
Mhm.
pops up. So again, having that expectation that it's not, for me, it may not always have everything on the playing field being equal. I'm going to be doing well in some areas and I'm going to be struggling with other areas. So it's that constant pivoting to figure out, how do I create the best balance in my life?
Mm. Absolutely. And one thing I didn't think to ask, but I'm curious about, are there variations of highly sensitive people?
You mean, like, is it on a spectrum?
Yes.
I don't have an answer for you. I mean, what Dr. Aaron says is it's something that we're born with. They've identified high sensitivity in at least 100 animal species. It's their survival trait. And so those animals that are highly sensitive are much better at survival because they're alert and tuned in and will do what they need to do to survive. My guess is that sensitivity shows up differently for lots of different people, and probably based on our upbringing. When we found out we were highly sensitive, we're probably going to have some areas that are going to be stronger for us than others, but I'm just speaking anecdotally. I really don't have anything to back that up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I also wonder about that too, in terms of categorically, is there sensitivity more in certain areas versus others?
Yeah. I would probably go back to the depth of processing,
Yes.
over arousability, overstimulation, emotional responsiveness, empathy, and awareness to subtle stimuli, that some of those may be higher or lower. And like with my husband, he's not a highly sensitive person, but in a couple of those areas, he does have sensitivity. So,
Mm,
it's not like everybody's going to show up the same.
absolutely. So let's say someone takes the test and finds out that they are, in fact, highly sensitive according to the tests that you recommended earlier, what
Mm-hmm.
are the next steps that they should do if they like this is like a aha moment of clarity for them?
You want to learn as much as you can about the trait. And I'm pretty cautious about who I refer people to because lots of people are talking about sensitivity. Dr. Aaron has a number of wonderful books. Dr. Ted Zeff, Zeff, especially
Yeah.
if you're a male, has done more work on boys and sensitivity. Dr.
Mm.
Aaron has, if you Google her on YouTube, she's got some YouTube videos. There's some
Okay.
great podcasts. It's not in production anymore, but there's a podcast called The Highly Sensitive Person. And that's a great podcast. Obviously, I think my podcast is pretty good, Unapologetically Sensitive. So you want to learn as much as you can about the trait and then find other highly sensitive people to hang out with. If you're finding that you're really stuck with having really strong reactions to things, you're having problems in relationships, you're having a hard time managing your time or overwhelmed, then you might want to reach out to a coach or a therapist. On Dr. Aaron's website, she has practitioners that are HS knowledgeable. So
Mm.
if you're listed on the website, that means that she has a book. I think it's called Psychotherapy and the Highly Sensitive Person. You need to have read that. You have to you have to complete a test and pass it in order to be listed as HS knowledgeable on her website. You can also Google if you're looking for a coach or therapist that's highly sensitive, and then you want to give them a test and ask them how they can help you and how they perceive high sensitivity. You really do want to interview whoever you're going to plan and see if you have practitioners because you want them to get it.
And you mentioned too that they should try to associate or kind of hang out or surround themselves with more highly sensitive people.
Mm-hmm.
Where do the highly sensitive folks hang out?
Yoga. Not at discos and concerts. There are meetups. Some cities have
Oh,
meetups online. If you're on Facebook, there are groups for highly sensitive people. I'm a little reluctant to say this, but there are groups of highly sensitive people where people have a lot of wounding and they haven't done their work. So you just want to be mindful about if you are in an online group, are the posts more positive? Are they people that are, when we find out about something, we want to talk about what doesn't work and we want to find
absolutely.
connection. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it's not my intention to sound like I'm being judgmental, but everybody's going to be in different stages of their healing. So, you want to think about that. What I would really say is think about the activities that you love, that nurture you, that restore you. And there's a good chance you're going to find other highly sensitive people doing those same things that you love, unless, you're atypical and you're, a rock band musician or something like that.
Absolutely. And I want to make sure I touch on something. You mentioned too that there was someone who had done highly sensitive work on men as well.
Ted Zeff, Zeff.
Hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that or
I'm,
his work at all? At all?
I can speak very poorly and inadequately about it. I believe his website is drtedzeff.com. He's written a book, again, I'm going to say it poorly. I think it's Strong Sensitive Boy. He's done some research on boys and men, and he has a TED Talk. He's done some podcasts. So if you just Google him, you can
Okay.
find the work that he's done. And really, we really need more men representing for the highly sensitive males because it's hard enough being highly sensitive in a female. And I can't even imagine what it's like if you're a guy.
Absolutely. And I'll definitely be sure to post those links in the show notes because I do think it's something that's important for men to also have that support as well. I know a lot of times when we get caught up in abuse or talking about things such as this, we tend to focus more on women. But I do want to try to start incorporating more resources for men as well, because I
Yeah.
do think that's important. And I do think it's also important for men to be in touch with their feelings and come from a strength-based approach as well.
Sure.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I don't know if you have any more resources that you want to recommend other than the wonderful stuff that you've already recommended, but do you have any other suggestions for the listeners out there?
Those are my primary go-tos, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. I would say start with that stuff, and then if you find other resources, there are other resources that I'm not as familiar with or not as aware of. There's some good TED Talks on sensitivity. I know Caroline Ferguson has done a TED Talk. Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then, so where can folks find you if they want to connect with you or, catch up with you in your podcast?
Best place to find me is at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I've got all of my social media there, anything you'd want to find out. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
That's great. And do you have any sort of upcoming projects or things that you're working on that people can support you on?
Oh, thanks for asking. We just launched our groups on highly sensitive people that have 8 modules to them. We'll be running them again in the fall. I say I collaborated with another highly sensitive person. I say this with the podcast too, sometimes and it's like, I don't know who else I'm talking about. It's just me. It's me and the mouse in my pocket. So in the fall, well, the truth is Jen and I will be running the groups again, and we run them individually. So all the information is on the website. We did an entire podcast about the overall strengths and struggles of highly sensitive people. We talked about boundaries and perfectionism and self-care and being authentic and demystifying emotions, just things that many people struggle with. So we've created an online course to help people if they want to do some skill building.
Okay, and so that's online,
Mm-hmm.
and it runs over the course of 8 weeks,
It's a 10-week course.
10 weeks,
We just started some groups and we'll be starting some more groups again in the fall.
and that's on your website.
Everything's on my website.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Patricia. I'm sure our listeners will love this, and
Oh,
I appreciate you coming to talk about this topic.
well, thank you so much, Dr. Jones. And I have to tell you that you were on my podcast and it's the most downloaded episode that I have to date. So the topic of narcissism really, really resonates with highly sensitive people. So thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest on my show.
Absolutely. Anytime. I appreciate coming up there and us collaborating. Thank you so
Mhm.
much.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, so that was my interview with Miss Patricia Young, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So please do let me know what you think about the show. As always, be sure to like, love, share, and subscribe to A Date with Darkness podcast. If you also know of someone who would be a great person to interview, either an expert or they want someone who wants to share their personal story about their relationship or their experience with a narcissist, please do email me at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. Looking forward to hearing your responses. As always, please be sure to hop on over and join the group, A Date with Darkness, on Facebook as well. Otherwise, hope to hear from you, and I'll also be on Instagram and Facebook, and the podcast will also be uploaded, the video version, on YouTube as well, on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, be well.